He walked into the palace at Ravenna and found a boy, 16 years old, sitting on the throne of the Caesars, the last man to hold the title that Augustus had created, that Trajan had expanded across 2 continents, that Constantine had carried into a new faith and a new capital, that 1,000 years of Roman will had sustained against every enemy the ancient world could produce. The boy's name was Romulus Augustulus, a cruel joke of history, named after both the founder of Rome and its first emperor, the beginning and the end, compressed into one 16-year-old who had no choice to be on this throne and had no idea what to do with it. Odoacer looked at him. The boy did not resist, did not speak, did not reach for a weapon or call for his guards or deliver the kind of final defiant speech that the occasion seemed to demand after 1,000 years of build-up. He simply held out the imperial insignia, the purple robe, the diadem, the symbols of a power that had once made the entire Mediterranean world kneel. Odoacer took them, and then he did something that no one in the room expected. Something that more than any battle or any invasion or any sacking of any city tells you everything you need to know about what Rome had actually become by the autumn of 476 AD. He sent them back to Constantinople with a letter explaining that the West no longer needed an emperor. Not because Rome had been destroyed, because it had become unnecessary. Rome was not conquered. That is the fact that 1,000 years of historical narrative has struggled to process, because it does not fit the story that empires are supposed to tell about themselves. Empires are supposed to fall in fire and blood, in the final heroic resistance of men who understood what they were losing and chose to die rather than surrender it. Rome is supposed to end with a last stand, the legions at the gates, the emperor on the walls, the eternal city consumed in the flames of barbarian fury. None of that happened. The Western Roman Empire ended with a 16-year-old handing over a robe to a man who did not even want the title that came with it. It ended not with a battle, but with a bureaucratic transaction. The peaceful, almost courteous transfer of symbols that had stopped meaning anything to the people who held them. Rome did not forget how to fight. It forgot why fighting mattered. It forgot what it was defending. It forgot, in the most catastrophic and irreversible way possible, that it was Rome. And the moment an empire forgets that, the moment the idea at the centre stops generating the loyalty and the sacrifice and the collective will that empires run on, the walls and the legions and the titles become props in a performance that everyone has already stopped believing in. This is not the story of how Rome fell. This is the story of how Rome stopped being Rome long before anyone noticed it was gone. To understand what was lost on September 4th, 476 AD, you must first understand what Rome actually was. Not as a territory, not as a military force, but as an idea that had been making the world organize itself around it for 1,000 years. At its peak, under Trajan in 117 AD, the Roman Empire covered 1.9 million square miles, from the Scottish Highlands to the Mesopotamian desert, from the Rhine to the Sahara. It was not merely the largest empire the ancient world had produced, it was the organizing principle of the ancient world. The roads that connected it, the law that governed it, the Latin that allowed a merchant in Britannia and a soldier in Syria and a senator in Rome to conduct their affairs in a shared language that carried, embedded in its grammar and its vocabulary, the assumption that civilization was Roman and Roman was civilization. The legions were a physical expression of this idea, not merely soldiers, a professional military culture so disciplined and so technically sophisticated that it had no meaningful peer anywhere in the ancient world.
Men who built roads and aqueducts and fortifications between campaigns. Men who carried Roman law into territories that had never heard of it and left behind, in the villages and towns that grew up around their camps, the infrastructure of a civilization that would outlast the empire itself. This was Rome at its fullest expression. Not a place, a force, a way of organizing human existence that had proved across 10 centuries to be more durable than any alternative the ancient world had offered. And then something happened that no military enemy had managed to accomplish. Rome began, slowly and then catastrophically, to stop believing in itself.
The decline was not a single event. It was a direction, a gradual, decades-long reorientation of everything that had made Rome function, away from the center and toward the edges, until the center had nothing left to hold. The money ran out first, not dramatically, not in a single collapse, but in the slow, grinding arithmetic of an empire spending more than it could generate. The constant wars at the borders, defending against the Goths, the Huns, the Vandals, the endless pressure of peoples being pushed westward by forces further east, required armies. Armies required pay. Pay required tax revenue. And the tax base of the Western Empire, which had always been weaker than the East, was being consumed by the same wars it was supposed to fund. The solution was to do what failing institutions always do when they run out of the resource their entire structure depends on. They dilute it. The legions had once been the most selective military organization in the ancient world. Roman citizenship required, physical standards enforced, years of training before deployment. The identity of a legionary was inseparable from the identity of Rome. To be one was to embody the other. By the 5th century, the Western Empire was recruiting barbarians to defend its borders against other barbarians, not as a temporary measure, as policy. The foederati, barbarian units fighting under Roman command, had become the backbone of an army that could no longer fill its ranks with Roman citizens because there were not enough Roman citizens willing to serve. This was not simply a military problem, it was an identity crisis expressed in military terms. The army that had made Rome Roman was being replaced by men who had never been Roman and had no particular interest in becoming so. Men who were loyal to their commanders, their wages, and their own people, not to the empire they were nominally defending. When the wages stopped, when the treasury ran dry, and the promises could not be kept, these men did not feel the weight of betrayal that a Roman soldier would have felt. They felt something simpler and more actionable. They felt unpaid. There is a moment in the decline of the Western Empire that history is treated as a minor anecdote and that deserves to be understood as something considerably more significant. In 410 AD, when the Visigoth king Alaric sacked Rome, the first time an enemy had taken the city in 800 years, the news was carried to the emperor Honorius at his court in Ravenna. Honorius, who had moved his capital away from Rome to the relative safety of the northeastern marshes, was reportedly inconsolable upon hearing the news, devastated, overcome with grief. He was grieving, it turned out, for his chicken. He had a favourite bird named Roma. When the messenger arrived with news that Roma had fallen, Honorius initially assumed it was his chicken. When he was informed that it was the city, that 800 years of continuous Roman civilization in the city of Rome's founding had just been violated for the first time in the history of the empire, he was, according to the sources, visibly relieved. His chicken was fine. This story is told as a joke, as one of history's funnier footnotes. The absurdity of an emperor more concerned with a bird than with the sack of his civilization's founding city. And it is funny in the way that things are funny when the alternative is too terrible to process directly. But look at it without the humour. Look at what it actually represents. The man at the centre of Roman imperial power, the man whose title connected him in an unbroken line to Augustus, to Julius Caesar, to the founders of the Republic,
received the news that Rome had fallen and felt relief because his personal pet was safe. The city of Rome had become less real to its emperor than a chicken named after it. This is not a joke, this is a diagnosis. This is the precise moment, rendered in miniature, of what had happened to the idea of Rome. The gap that had opened between the symbol and the reality, between the title and the weight it was supposed to carry, between the purple robe and the power it had once represented. Honorius was not unusual, he was symptomatic. The Western Empire had been producing emperors like him for decades, men who inherited a title without inheriting an understanding of what the title required, who sat in courts increasingly disconnected from the borders where the empire was actually being lost, who managed the symbols of power while the substance of power drained away into the hands of military commanders and barbarian kings who were doing the actual work of governing and defending what remained. By 476, when Odoacer walked into Ravenna, the imperial title was not worth fighting for, not because Rome had been destroyed, because it had been so thoroughly hollowed out that the man who defeated it did not even want it.
Odoacer was not a destroyer. This is the detail that matters most about the man who ended the Western Roman Empire, and it is the detail that the conventional narrative of Rome's fall most consistently obscures. He was a soldier, the son of a chieftain of the Scyrian people, one of the Germanic tribes that had spent generations living alongside, fighting alongside, and being absorbed into the Roman military system. He had served in the Roman army. He understood Roman administration. He spoke Latin. He knew how the empire worked from the inside, its structures, its hierarchies, its paperwork, its particular combination of military force and bureaucratic management that had kept the whole apparatus running across 10 centuries. When his troops, the Federati, who had been promised land in Italy and had been refused by the military commander Orestes, rose up and killed Orestes and marched on Ravenna, Odoacer did not march as a conqueror. He marched as a man who understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who had watched the institution from the inside, that the Western Empire was a structure without a foundation, that the title of emperor in the West was a costume that had outlasted the body it was supposed to dress. He deposed Romulus Augustulus with notable mercy. The boy was 16. He was not responsible for what he had inherited. Odoacer gave him a pension and sent him to a comfortable exile in Campania in the south of Italy, where he lived, remarkably, for decades, growing old in a villa that had once belonged to the general who first brought Rome to the edge of catastrophe. He did not take the title of emperor. He sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople with a letter explaining that one emperor for the whole empire was sufficient, and that he would govern Italy as king under the theoretical sovereignty of the Eastern Court. The Eastern Emperor Zeno, who had his own problems and was not particularly positioned to argue, accepted this arrangement. And with that, with a letter, a pension and a diplomatic accommodation between pragmatic men, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. Not in fire, not in a final battle, in paperwork. The date historians use is September 4, 476 AD, the day Romulus Augustulus handed over the insignia, the day the last holder of the title that Augustus had created surrendered it without a fight. But Rome did not die on September 4, 476 AD. Rome died in increments. In the Battle of Adrianople in 378, when 2/3 of the Roman army and the emperor himself were destroyed by the Goths they had mistreated. In the sack of 410, when Alaric walked through gates that 800 years of Roman power had kept closed to every enemy. In the movement of the capital to Ravenna, away from Rome, away from the symbolic art of everything the empire claimed to be. In the recruitment of foederati, who owed their loyalty to wages rather than to the idea of Rome. In the chicken. Most of all, it died in the gap, the widening, irreversible gap between what Rome claimed to be and what it had actually become, between the title and the substance, between the purple robe and the power it was supposed to represent. Civilizations do not die when their enemies become strong enough to destroy them.
They die when the idea at their centre, the shared belief that makes the sacrifice worthwhile, that makes the taxes payable and the army recruitable and the laws enforceable, stops generating the loyalty it requires. Rome stopped generating that loyalty long before Odoacer arrived in Ravenna. The emperor who grieved for his chicken while his city burned had already told you everything you needed to know about how this story ended. The men who refused to die for a title that the man who held it did not understand had already made their decision. The soldiers who put down their weapons and waited for someone to pay them had already chosen. Odoacer did not destroy Rome, he simply walked into the space that Rome had left when it stopped being there. And the boy on the throne handed him the robe, and the robe meant nothing, and the robe had not meant anything for a very long time. Every civilization that ever existed has believed with the sincere and unexamined conviction of something that has never been fully tested, that it is the permanent condition of the world. Rome believed this more completely and for longer than almost any other. It had earned a belief. 10 centuries of roads and law and legions and the Latin language spreading across the known world like a tide that could not be reversed. The tide reversed. Not because the barbarians were stronger, because Rome at some point that no single historian can precisely identify and no single event can fully explain, stopped believing that the tide was worth maintaining. Stopped believing that what it was defending was worth the cost of defending it. Stopped being in the only sense that ultimately matters for any empire or any civilization or any human institution that requires the voluntary sacrifice of its members to function. Stopped being something that people believed in enough to die for. When that stops, the walls become scenery, the titles become costumes, the emperor becomes a 16-year-old boy with an inherited robe and no understanding of what it means. And the man who comes to take it looks at the boy, looks at the robe, looks at the 1,000 years of accumulated weight that the symbol is supposed to carry, and decides it is not worth keeping. The lights did not go out on September 4, 476 AD. They had been dimming for a century. What happened in Ravenna that autumn was simply the moment when someone finally noticed the room was dark.